Hello, I'm Jamie Wondolowski, and I'm going to be discussing protecting critical infrastructure from cyber threats. I'm going to be talking about the evolution of threats the United States has seen, what some of the current practices are for preventing cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, and some recommendations for security managers and leadership in critical infrastructure sectors. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about the history of the threats that the United States has seen really in the past 50 to 60 years. Previously, we've been looking a lot at terrorist threats and things such as the nuclear threat from countries such as Russia. Now, these are different in a large way from cyber threats, and that previously the United States has defended ourselves against threats that we could see coming from a large-scale nation, generally from a wealthier adversary. And so something to where, for like a nuclear threat, if they move it, if you actually launch a nuclear weapon, there are going to be definite repercussions, much we discussed with mutually assured destruction. Cyber attack is different in that it can be a much smaller scale. It can be independent actors, large nations. They can be behind it, but also step back and be like, that wasn't us. We don't know who did that. And there's a plausible deniability factor that there simply hasn't really been in terrorist and nuclear attacks in the past. So what we're seeing is malware attacks in particular have grown exponentially in the past 10 years. And part of that is because it doesn't require the funding, it doesn't require the coordination, it doesn't require the support that previous threats to U.S. infrastructure have seen. So that is something we should definitely consider and think about as I move through this project. To look at this, I'm going to argue that there are three primary protections or mitigations against cyber threats, and the first one is going to be cyber diplomacy. We just alluded to Russia, and so the same thing with China. This is going to be working with our adversaries to try and come up with agreements that are going to prevent cyber attacks from occurring. Similar to what we had to do with nuclear arms deals, those are the same type of deals that are going to have to come between the United States and some of our near-peer adversaries when it comes to cyber attacks to prevent ourselves from being attacked in that manner. Additionally, the presence of a national framework does not currently exist. Part of the reason for that is the diversity that is present in a lot of our SCADA systems, simply because of the times from when they were built, the reasons behind why they were built, and the priorities that were in place when a lot of these systems were put in to our critical infrastructure. And so to upgrade that to one national framework has been prohibitive up to this point, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's not something that as a nation we don't need to strive towards finding a national framework to help us protect ourselves. And finally, I'm going to talk about some of the smaller things that security managers can do, educating security managers on best practices to try and ensure that local critical infrastructure sectors are protected. First adversary I would really like to talk about is Russia. With Russia, for Russian threats, a lot of the time when we think about their cyber presence, we think about their influence warfare. And it's correct to think about it for this way. The Russian presence in Latin America and just online, even in America, has grown greatly over the past several years. The election meddling, whether you believe it or not, Russia is having a presence in the day-to-day computers, the sites that we visit. And they are trying to put a presence in, say, Latin America. And the reason this is a threat to critical infrastructure is not because it's Russia conducting an attack on our critical infrastructure, but more because they are trying to affect the way people think about the United States and the United States government. And so if Russia can inspire people to conduct independent hacking operations, if they independently shut down water sources, if they independently attack a financial sector or a commercial sector, then that's not Russia conducting that. That's somebody else who did it. But really what Russia is doing is they are conducting behind independent threats, independent attacks on elements of critical infrastructure. And that's all due to that influence warfare. So that is one of the ways that Russia conducts its attacks. Additionally, Russia conducts direct attacks to begin with. The NotPetya attack is one of the best known attacks. It originated out of a server room in the Ukraine, and what it did was it shut down the Maersk Corporation, the Merck Corporation, and several others. I mention the Maersk and the Merck Corporation in particularly because Merck, for those who are not familiar with pharmaceuticals, they are a pharmaceutical company, and by shutting down their operations for about a week, it limits pharmaceutical production, and it also increases the prices for things like that. So it's going to decrease availability and affect their operations. The Maersk Corporation is actually a Dutch corporation. It's not a U.S. corporation, but it is a cornerstone in U.S. transportation, particularly in shipping. If you've ever been out to sea, if you've ever been on the waterfront, you'll see lots of ships with Maersk on the title or on the side. And that's because they do a lot of these global shippings. So when they could not load their ships, that meant that for miles and miles in New Jersey, there are trucks that can't unload their goods. They can't put perishable goods on the ship to be shipped wherever they need to be. The manufacturing sectors that are relying on parts and goods from that Maersk is going to deliver, they're not getting what they need. So it's going to have a downstream effect for everyone who's reliant on what is coming in on these Maersk ships. And so that was one of the things that Russia was able to conduct, and they were able to successfully launch an attack on the transportation sector. The other international threat I really want to focus on is China. China is interesting in that for many, many years we've looked at what is the Chinese Great Firewall, which keeps them from Googling Tiananmen Square or using Facebook or whatever. And as a country, we've looked and been like, that's bad. China, you shouldn't do that. But we don't really interfere in what China's allowed to do. China does whatever it wants on its own people. And that is until 2015 when they took the lessons it had learned from that Great Firewall and began putting it on U.S. websites and limiting things that the U.S. could say, limiting our speech. Because of what they had developed on their firewall, they just exported on us. So because of that, and as well as their propensity to lack respect for trade secrets, to use those against the manufacturing sector and to try and get a leg up for themselves, they pose a threat to some of those sectors as well. The United States has implemented several different documents to try and provide guidance for how we should address these threats. There is the Cyberspace Policy Review. There are the Department of Homeland Security's 5 Pillars for Cybersecurity. There's the 2018 National Cyber Strategy. And while they all have important ideas that security managers definitely need to read and be aware of, they are more guidelines. It's a process for security managers to work through, but really they're going to have to be the ones to implement their own security measures just because of the diversity that is in place. So real quick, while I still have a little bit of time, I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that leadership and security managers can do to protect their own critical infrastructure sectors. For leadership and security managers, they need to scan their SCADA systems regularly, routinely, to see what current security barriers are in place and any patches that might not have been put in. Those patches, they're going to often have to reach out to their vendors and make sure that patches for their systems are updated and that anytime something new comes out, they get updated as soon as possible. This is going to prevent an attack from being able to get into these systems. It's going to be that communication. That communication really between the public and private sector is key. As we all know, contractors, especially in the cyber realm, are very, very common. Good thing, it can do a lot of good, but contracting also has a limited time frame. A lot of the time, a government contractor, sometimes it's there for a year, sometimes it's there for 5. Sometimes there's a gap in coverage, or you're changing over from one company to another. And in that time, communication is especially critical. So involvement between security managers and leadership with those public entities is going to be key to make sure that, especially when there's a changeover, you're not going to lack coverage in that time. The security managers on a local level, accessing or limiting the access policy restrictions. This is going to limit the number of people who can access these sites, and that's going to be important. Need to put in as many network firewalls as possible with the diversity in there between commercial, off-the-shelf, network-based, tailored, and internal. Training individuals on what suspicious emails and suspicious links looks like, and also disallowing access to websites that are going to be common. So your Facebooks and things like that, that's where a lot of malware will come from. So prohibiting people from being able to access those on these systems is also going to be an important key to limiting the threat for cyber attacks in critical infrastructure. I appreciate everyone's time. I know it's a little bit long, but I really appreciate it, and I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you.